Dark Eldar in the Calixis sector and the Koronus Expanse. Quote, "They are a scourge upon our galaxy, the vilest and sadistic of all our Xenos foes, and a peril to any who would ply the void in search of profit or gain. Whatever happens, should the shadow of their ships darken your path, pray you to die fighting at the helm of your vessel, lest fortune favors you and they take you alive." End of quote from Magos Domos Agnolane, Explorator. The Calixis sector and Koronus Expanse are regions that have some significance to the Eldar, and while it has been many millennia since they have had any major presence there, the worlds of that great frontier are still laced with many thousands of Webway passages and tunnels connecting worlds and star systems. Today, these tunnels are twisted, stretched, and torn by the psychic pressure of the warp storms dividing the Calixis sector and Koronus Expanse. While the mysterious rites of the Harlequins long ago sealed many of these passages, others still remain open to the tides of the warp, infested with vile and ephemeral creatures. This region of damaged tunnels is centered across the warp storm known as the Screaming Vortex. The vortex is home to teeming hordes of demon-worshippers and mutants, living and dying at the whims of warlords and sorcerers intent on murder and subjugation in the name of the dark gods. While this is a ready source of slaves and victims for the raids of the region's Kabals, it is a realm largely inhospitable to the Dark Eldar, so strong is the presence of she who thirsts within the storm. However, suspended at some point between the Screaming Vortex, the Koronus Expanse, and the Webway is an island of relative stability where numerous groups of Dark Eldar have formed a twisted haven. Here floats the Nexus of Shadows, a Dark Eldar outpost built upon an ancient and massive technological relic. 3 major Kabals dwell in the tunnels and passageways that cross the Calixis sector, the Koronus Expanse, and into the Screaming Vortex. The foremost of these, at the heart of the Nexus, is the Cabal of the Splintered Talon. The others, the Cabal of the Shadowed Thorns and the Cabal of the Crimson Woe, are of a more mercenary inclination due to their lesser status, often selling their murderous skills to other races in exchange for resources or opportunities to grasp at power. The Cabal of the Crimson Woe operates in the Calixis sector more than in the Koronus Expanse, in part to avoid directly competing with the Cabal of the Shadowed Thorns and thus drawing their ire. Numerous other groups exist alongside these, for the Cult of the Withered Blade, which controls the blood spine pits on the Nexus of Shadows, and the Sutured Helix, a coven of Heman that operates from the Nexus of Shadows, to numerous smaller factions that raid and scavenge for scraps of the better's might and prestige. The Dark Eldar operating near the Nexus of Shadows are frequently on the move, either carried within fleets of void ships or traveling in smaller groups on light skimmers through the winding and impossible labyrinth of the Webway. The Dark Eldar operating near the Nexus of Shadows are frequently on the move, either carried within fleets of void ships or traveling in smaller groups on light skimmers through the winding and impossible labyrinth of the Webway, returning to the Nexus of Shadows only periodically to trade the cargo of tormented victims for supplies and to replace slain warriors. These itinerant raiders often cross paths with pirates and reavers of other species, particularly the chaos-aligned flotillas that hail from the Screaming Vortex and isolated bases like Iniquity. A select few of these have been shown the location of the Nexus, so that they may trade in slaves, dark lore, and abhorrent technologies, but these are relatively rare. The Dark Eldar are a plague upon the Koronus Expanse. Raiders, slavers, pirates, and even rogue traders suffer at the barbed lashes and blades. Any woe cross the moor and sail the void of the Koronus Expanse learn to fear the wicked silhouettes of their void ships and the seemingly endless cruelty towards all life, including their own. Only vigilance and firepower keep the worst depredations of these terrible raiders at bay, though from the dens of Footfall to the commerce halls of Port Wonder there are countless tales of crew lost and ships savaged in the sudden attacks. Within the Calixis sector, the Imperial Navy keeps the warp routes and sector worlds protected against the worst of these raids, and while some outposts and lone vessels still disappear at the hands of the foul Xenos, most Imperial citizens sleep soundly, never even knowing that such a depraved species haunts the stars above their heads. In the Koronus Expanse, it is different, as that lawless place has neither a fleet capable of guarding the uncharted wastes nor a tightly controlled network of worlds that can call upon one another in times of need. The Expanse is a playground for the Dark Eldar, where along with the myriad of other alien menaces they can raid worlds and take void ships with relative impunity, slipping away into the night from whence they came. The power of the Dark Eldar is compounded by the fact that no one knows precisely where they come from or where they go, nor can they explain the aliens' uncanny ability to appear from nowhere and then vanish with the stolen cargoes of goods and slaves just as quickly. Some rogue traders believe there must be a Dark Eldar world somewhere in the Expanse from which they launch their raids, though where exactly it is and how it could have evaded detection for so long remain a mystery that has yet to be unraveled. Selene Morn, Archon of the Cabal of the Shadowed Thorns. Quote, "There is no good story without a villain. I shall provide you with an antagonist beyond your imaginings or even your comprehension, and as you die you will curse my name exquisitely." End of quote from Dracarys, Master of the Sutured Helix. The Galan Sphere, upon which the Nexus of Shadows was built, is an ancient relic of a long-forgotten age of technology. The size of a small moon, covered with towers and antennae, the sphere was crafted around a solid core, the remnants of some mineral-rich asteroid that its automated systems are slowly eroding away as it adds more and more levels to the sphere. Neither the Galan Sphere's alien inhabitants nor those few explorers from the Imperium who have had a chance to study it know its true purpose. How the sphere came to enter the Webway is also a mystery. Abandoned for untold ages, the sphere could have drifted through a web gate or even been drawn towards one by the ancient programs and protocols of its cogitators seeking to study a breach in the Webway that it perceived as a celestial phenomenon. Alternatively, it is possible that some unknown force moved it into the Webway for some inscrutable purpose. Once it entered the Webway, the sphere spent eons drifting from one region to another before becoming trapped in a confluence of ancient forces and alien power fields. Now it floats in a relatively stable position, more debris of a forgotten age of enlightenment. It was Selene Morn and her Cabal of the Shadowed Thorns that first rediscovered the Galan Sphere and decided to put it to use. After being exiled from Camorra, the Archon spent many Terran years wandering the Webway with her fleet, raiding worlds and looking for a place to claim as her own. The sphere, with its well-hidden location and ancient technology, presented the perfect place for a new home. Unfortunately for Selene, the sphere's defenses and legions of servitor guardians were too numerous and powerful for her Cabal alone to overcome. Thus, Selene forged an alliance with Zagan Kul and his Cabal of the Splintered Talon, and together they purged the city of its ancient human defenses, destroying that which they could not control and sealing away the areas that they could not inhabit. Even though the forces had secured a landing zone and deactivated the aging orbital defenses, it was to take years for the Dark Eldar to carve out the areas where they would build the city. As more Dark Eldar came to the Nexus, new sections would be cleared of their ancient automated defenses. Often the Dark Eldar would drive thousands of slaves into an area to identify these dangers, or simply to exhaust a turret's ammunition so it could be destroyed. Other Xenos races were also allowed to settle in the Nexus as part of trading missions, though these aliens had to clear their own areas for inhabitation. The lasting result of this wanton conquest by the Dark Eldar and their allies is that many areas of the Nexus still show signs of battle, and the stripped remains of the combat machinery of the sphere is a common sight along its shadowed streets. Occasionally, the Nexus Eld defenders rear their heads once again, but the Dark Eldar usually put them down swiftly. Almost immediately after the arrival of the Dark Eldar and its establishment as a port, the Nexus began to operate as a hub for trade and a base for raiding. Close to the Koronus Expanse and the Calixis sector, it opened up fresh opportunities for slavers and worlds that before had been out of reach or too dangerous to raid using the fractured remains of the Webway. The Nexus of Shadows quickly grew in size and wealth on the backs of its slaves, despite the fact that most Dark Eldar of Camorra at least openly shuns the cursed place and the outcasts who live there. The Xenos of the Koronus Expanse and the renegades of the Screaming Vortex have no such compunctions, however, and have found the Nexus to be a useful place to trade and congregate, a place far from the reach of the Imperium and utterly hostile to its agents. Selene welcomed such factions into her city on account of the wealth and influence they offered, as well as the added protection it afforded her against those who would try and take the city from her. Unfortunately for Selene, it was not an outside force or an alien that was to oust her from power. In the end, one of her own, Zagan Kul, usurped her and exiled her once more into the Webway before she could do the same to him. For many of the inhabitants of the Nexus, this change in power meant little, especially for the slaves, to whom one Dark Eldar Archon is much the same as another. For many of the inhabitants of the Nexus, this change in power meant little, especially for the slaves, to whom one Dark Eldar Archon is much the same as another. Selene Morn intentionally projects a presence that is both evasive and unmistakable. Her dread majesty is as hard to put into words as it is to ignore. Appearing at once menacing and tempting, the Archon catches many of her foes off guard, uncertain of the obfuscated nature of this ancient being. Morn is several thousand Terran years old, though only she knows for certain how long she has been alive, and has seen and done much that would long haunt the nightmares of lesser beings. Like all Dark Eldar Archons, she is possessed of a deadly martial prowess, but her true weapon is a mind finely honed by the lethal intrigues of Camorra's high society. She finds it utterly distasteful, then, that she and all those she commands are exiles from the Dark City and now even the Nexus of Shadows. At her grudging command, the warriors of her cabal have turned to mercenary work, selling their efforts to lesser beings as part of a plan to regain the power she once possessed. On the rarest of occasions, she deigns to speak to these prey creatures herself.